The chandelier light fractured across 1,000 crystal edges, but the moment Ethan Caldwell saw her again, everything else in the room went dark. The ballroom stretched wide beneath vaulted ceilings, filled with tailored suits, silk gowns, and the low hum of wealth pretending to be quiet. The kind of room where deals were made in handshakes and broken in whispers. But none of that reached him now. Not the laughter, not the clink of champagne glasses, not the orchestra threading soft notes through the air, because standing at the far end of the marble floor, framed by gold-lit columns and a slow-turning spotlight, was Amara Bennett, and she was no longer the woman he had once left behind. She didn't rush, didn't scan the room for approval, didn't carry the nervous tension he remembered. Instead, she moved with a calm that bent attention toward her without asking, her dress a deep, understated black that caught the light only when she shifted, her shoulders relaxed, her chin level, her presence measured, controlled, undeniable, and beside her, holding her hand with quiet certainty, was a little boy. Ethan's breath didn't stop all at once. It tightened, like the air had thickened, like the distance between them had weight, because the child wasn't just any child, not just another guest's son wandering through a formal event. There was something in the way he walked, in the way his small fingers wrapped around Amara's hand, in the way his eyes lifted toward the room with calm curiosity instead of fear, something familiar enough to unsettle, something precise enough to disturb. And when the boy turned his head slightly, catching the reflection of the chandelier in his eyes, Ethan felt something inside him shift into place with a quiet, terrifying clarity. The same shape, the same gaze, the same unspoken intensity he had seen in mirrors his entire life. The orchestra continued. The room continued. Conversations rose and fell, but for Ethan, time thinned into a narrow line drawn between where he stood and where she walked, and every step she took felt deliberate, like a countdown he hadn't agreed to but couldn't stop. Years collapsed in his mind not as memories, but as weight, pressing backward into a single moment he had buried under success, under headlines, under acquisitions and quarterly wins, a moment he had convinced himself no longer mattered. A dimly lit apartment. Rain tapping against glass. Her voice steady but breaking underneath. His words colder than he had intended, or maybe exactly as cold as he had meant them to be. You were never enough. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't needed to. The silence after had done the rest. He remembered the way she had stood there, still, absorbing it, not arguing, not pleading, just taking in the final shape of who he had decided to be in her life. And then she had nodded, once, like she understood something he didn't, something he hadn't even considered, and that had unsettled him more than anger ever could have. He had expected tears. He had expected resistance. Instead, she had given him quiet, and then she had left. No scene, no closure, just absence. Back in the present, Ethan's fingers tightened slightly around the glass in his hand, though he hadn't realized he was holding one, and the cold surface pressed into his palm like a reminder that this moment was real, that she was here, not a memory, not a regret filed away for later, but present, alive, transformed. The boy looked up at her and said something too soft to hear, and she leaned down slightly, her expression softening in a way that didn't weaken her, but revealed something deeper, something earned, and she answered him with a small smile that didn't belong to the past Ethan remembered. That smile wasn't for him. It wasn't shaped by him. It existed entirely outside of him, and that realization landed heavier than anything else. He took a step forward without deciding to, drawn not by intention but by gravity, the kind that forms when truth waits long enough to be seen. Around him, people shifted, some recognizing him, some moving aside out of instinct, but he barely registered them, because the closer he got, the clearer it became that Amara wasn't avoiding him. She wasn't scanning for him either. She simply existed in the same space as him without acknowledging his presence at all, and that absence of reaction carried more force than confrontation ever could. The boy turned again, this time more directly, his eyes landing on Ethan for just a second longer than coincidence would allow. And there it was again, undeniable now, not a resemblance that could be dismissed, not a passing similarity, but something rooted deeper, something written into bone and expression and stillness. Ethan felt his chest tighten, not from panic, not from confusion, but from the slow, precise realization of what those years had hidden, what that silence had protected, what her absence had carried without his knowledge. He stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak, close enough to be seen, and for the first time since she entered the room, Amara's eyes lifted toward him. There was no shock there, no hesitation, no flicker of the past, just recognition, clean and controlled, like she had already accounted for this moment long before he arrived. The noise of the room seemed to shift then, not quieter, but less relevant, like everything around them had lost its priority, and in that narrow space between them, the past and present aligned in a way that left no room for denial. Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came immediately, not because he didn't have them, but because none of them felt sufficient, none of them matched the weight of what stood in front of him. Amara didn't rush to fill the silence. She didn't offer explanation. She didn't soften the moment. She simply stood there, her hand still resting lightly on the boy's shoulder, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, and in that stillness, Ethan understood something he hadn't before, that whatever had happened in the years between them, whatever she had built, whatever she had endured, it had not been shaped by him, and it did not require him now. The boy glanced between them, sensing something without understanding it, his small fingers tightening slightly, as if anchoring himself to the only certainty he knew. And Ethan's gaze dropped just enough to catch that movement, to see the quiet trust in it, the familiarity, the unspoken connection that had formed without him. When he looked back up, Amara was still watching. Him, not waiting, not demanding, just allowing the truth to exist without interference. And in that moment, under the weight of light and memory and everything left unsaid, Ethan felt the first real fracture in the version of himself he had spent years building. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet break, like something long held in place had finally given way. The distance between them did not close, but something invisible shifted, like the room itself had begun to recognize the gravity of what stood there, unspoken yet undeniable, and Ethan felt it in the way his chest rose slower, heavier, as if each breath had to move through years of silence before reaching him. And when he finally found his voice, it came lower than he expected, controlled but edged with something unfamiliar, something that did not belong to the man who had once walked away so easily. Amara. Her name rested between them without invitation, without ownership, just a sound shaped by memory, and she did not flinch at it, did not soften or react in the way he had once known. Instead, she held his gaze for a moment longer, then shifted her attention gently toward the boy beside her, her hand brushing lightly over his shoulder in a gesture so natural, so practiced, that it carried years within it. And only after that did she look back at Ethan, her voice calm, even, untouched by the tension that pressed against him from all sides. "Good evening, Ethan." There was no warmth, but there was no bitterness either, and somehow that unsettled him more, because it meant she had moved past something he was only just beginning to understand. The boy looked up at Ethan again, curious now, his head tilting slightly, studying him with the quiet focus children have when they sense something important without knowing why. And Ethan could not look away, not from the eyes, not from the expression that mirrored his own in ways that made denial impossible. And the realization pressed deeper, not sharp, not explosive, but steady, like a truth that had waited patiently to be acknowledged. "What is your name?" Ethan asked. Though the question felt smaller than everything else in the moment, the boy answered without hesitation, his voice clear, confident, "Noah." The name settled into Ethan's mind with a weight he could not explain, and for a brief second, something flickered behind his eyes, a quiet calculation of time, of absence, of everything that had unfolded without him being there to witness it. And when he looked back at Amara, the question he had not yet formed was already waiting in the space between them. She saw it, of course she did, but she did not rush to answer, did not fill the silence with explanations or history. She simply let it exist, because for the first time, the burden of understanding did not belong to her. Around them, the gala continued, voices rising, laughter echoing, servers moving with trays balanced in practiced rhythm. But the world beyond their small circle felt distant, irrelevant, like a stage where the background noise had been turned down to allow a single conversation to carry the entire weight of the moment. Ethan shifted his stance slightly, grounding himself, trying to reconcile the man he had become with the reality now standing in front of him. And it did not align the way he expected, because the version of himself he had built over the years was designed for control, for certainty, for outcomes he could predict and shape. But this was something else entirely, something that existed outside of his influence. And that lack of control unsettled him in a way no business risk ever had. "You look different," he said, the words inadequate the moment they left his mouth. And Amara's lips curved just slightly, not in amusement, not in mockery, but in acknowledgement of how little that statement captured. "I am," she replied simply, and there was nothing else added. No explanation of the years that had shaped her, no recounting of the nights she had faced alone, no detailing of the work it had taken to stand where she stood now, because none of that required his validation anymore. Noah shifted closer to her, his small hand tightening around hers, and Ethan noticed the instinctive way she adjusted, the subtle movement that positioned herself between him and the boy without making it obvious, a quiet act of protection that spoke louder than any words could have, and something inside him reacted to that, not with anger, but with a sharp awareness of what he had not earned, what he had no right to claim. "We should not do this here," Amara said then, her tone still even, but firmer now, not dismissive, not defensive, just clear, and Ethan understood immediately. This was not a conversation for public spaces, not something to be shaped under chandeliers and quiet scrutiny, and for a moment, he considered pushing, insisting, demanding clarity the way he once might have. But that instinct faded before it could fully form, replaced by something else, something slower, more careful, as if the stakes had finally become real in a way he could not ignore. "Then where?" he asked, and there was no command in his voice this time, only a question, and that difference did not go unnoticed. Amara studied him for a second, measuring something, not his words, but the shift behind them, and then she nodded once, a small, deliberate motion. "Tomorrow. 10 in the morning. My office." She reached into her bag with one hand, her movements unhurried, and pulled out a simple card, holding it between her fingers for just a moment before handing it to him. And when he took it, their hands did not touch, the space between them maintained with quiet precision, as if even that small boundary mattered. Ethan glanced down at the card, reading the name printed in clean, understated lettering, Bennett and Cole Consulting, the address beneath it placed in one of the most competitive business districts in the city, and for a brief second, surprise flickered through him, not because he doubted her ability, but because he had never imagined her building something that would intersect with his world at this level, this directly. When he looked back up, she was already turning slightly, her attention shifting away from him, her focus returning to Noah, and the transition was seamless, natural, like stepping out of one role and fully into another. And that, more than anything else, made it clear how complete her life had become without him in it. "Come on," she said softly to Noah, and he nodded, his hand still secure in hers. His gaze lingering on Ethan for just a moment longer before he followed her lead, and together they moved away, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady, leaving Ethan standing where he was, the card still in his hand, the weight of it far greater than its size suggested. He watched them go, not because he expected them to turn back, but because he needed to see it, needed to understand the reality of what he had missed, what had existed parallel to his life without ever intersecting with it until now. And as they disappeared into the movement of the crowd, the room seemed to return all at once, the sound rushing back in, the light reasserting itself. But something had changed, something fundamental, something that could not be undone by time or distance or success. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him heavier than it entered, and for the first time in years, he felt the edge of something he could not control, not fear, not panic, but consequence, quiet and patient, waiting for him to finally face it. The city felt quieter the next morning, not because it was, but because Ethan Caldwell noticed it for the first time in years, the hum of traffic below his penthouse windows, the distant rhythm of construction, the soft echo of footsteps in hallways that had always been there, but never required his attention. And now every sound seemed to stretch longer, settle deeper, as if the world had slowed just enough for him to feel the weight of what waited ahead. And when he glanced at the card resting on the glass table beside him, The clean lettering of Bennett and Cole Consulting no longer looked like a simple introduction. It looked like a line drawn between who he had been and who he was about to confront. He arrived 10 minutes early, something he rarely did, not out of habit, but because something in him refused to risk being late to a moment he already felt unprepared for, and the building itself reflected the kind of quiet authority he recognized immediately: polished stone, clean glass, security that did not need to be visible to be present, the kind of place where power moved without announcement. And as he stepped inside, the cool air brushed against his skin, grounding him just enough to keep his thoughts from spiraling into questions he could not yet answer. The receptionist greeted him with professional warmth, not recognizing him as anything other than a scheduled appointment, and that alone shifted something inside him, because for once, his name did not arrive before he did. His reputation did not open doors ahead of him, and he found himself simply nodding, stating who he was, waiting like anyone else. And when she directed him toward the private elevator, he followed without speaking further, his reflection in the mirrored walls catching his eye for a brief second, composed, controlled, but not untouched, not the version of himself he had once believed to be unshakable. The doors opened onto a quiet floor, minimal, deliberate, the kind of design that did not waste space or attention, and at the far end, through a stretch of glass, he saw her again. Amara stood near a wide desk, reviewing something on a tablet, her posture straight, her focus complete, and for a moment, he did not move, not because he was unsure of what to do, but because seeing her in this environment confirmed what the card had only suggested: she belonged here, not as a guest, not as an outsider stepping into a world she had not been invited to, but as someone who had built this space herself, shaped it, owned it in a way that required no external validation. When she looked up, it was not with surprise. She had known he would arrive, had expected it, and the brief pause that followed was not hesitation, but acknowledgement, as if both of them understood that this moment carried more than a simple conversation could hold. "You are early," she said, her tone neutral, not impressed, not dismissive, just observant, and Ethan stepped forward, closing the distance with measured calm. "I did not want to be late." The words were simple, but they carried something unfamiliar, an awareness of time not as something he controlled, but as something he had already lost once. She nodded slightly, setting the tablet aside, and gestured toward the seating area near the window, the city stretching out below in quiet lines of motion and structure, a view that spoke of scale, of reach, of perspective, and he followed her lead, taking a seat across from her, the space between them smaller than the night before, but heavier now, more defined. For a moment, neither of them spoke, not out of discomfort, but because silence had become something else between them, not empty, not avoidant, but deliberate, a space where truth could exist without interruption, and Ethan realized then that he did not know how to begin, not in a way that would match what this moment required. "Noah," he said finally, the name steady but weighted. "He is." The sentence did not finish, but it did not need to, and Amara held his gaze without flinching, without softening the reality he was reaching toward. "Yes," she answered, a single word, clear, grounded, and absolute. And in that moment, the uncertainty that had lingered dissolved into something more solid, more difficult, because knowing carried responsibility in a way that suspicion never did. Ethan leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, not sharply, not dramatically, just a controlled release of something he had been holding since the night before, and his mind moved quickly now, not toward denial, but toward understanding, toward the timeline, the years, the choices made without his awareness. And when he looked at her again, there was no accusation in his expression, only a question that had shifted shape. "Why did you not tell me?" It was not asked with anger, not even with frustration, but with something quieter, something closer to confusion, and Amara did not respond immediately, not because she did not have an answer, but because she chose when to give it. She leaned back slightly, mirroring his posture, her hands resting lightly together, composed, grounded, and when she spoke, her voice carried no weight of defense, only truth. "You left," she said, and the simplicity of it landed harder than anything more complex could have, because it did not require explanation, it did not require elaboration. It stood on its own, complete, and unchangeable. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in recognition, because she was right, not in a way that could be debated, not in a way that could be reframed, but in a way that connected directly to the version of himself he had chosen to be at that time. And for a moment, the room felt smaller, not physically, but in the way consequences close in when they are finally acknowledged. I would have, he started, then stopped, the rest of the sentence catching somewhere between intention and reality, because whatever he might have done then did not exist anymore. It could not change what had already unfolded, and Amara saw that hesitation, saw the realization behind it, and she did not interrupt, did not correct him. She simply allowed him to sit with it. You would have what? She asked calmly, not pressing, not challenging, just asking the question that required honesty. And Ethan looked at her, really looked this time, not at the woman he remembered, but at the one in front of him now, the one who had built a life, raised a child, created something substantial without him, and for the first time, he did not answer from habit, from ego, from the need to maintain control. He answered from where he stood now. I do not know, he admitted, and the truth of that did not weaken him. It shifted something that had remained rigid for too long, and Amara nodded slightly, not in agreement, not in approval, but in acknowledgement of honesty when it appeared. The conversation did not end there, but it changed, not in volume, not in pace, but in depth, because now it was no longer about whether the truth existed, it was about what it meant, and outside the glass walls of her office, the city continued as it always had, unaware that inside, two lives that had once separated completely were beginning to intersect again, not by chance, not by force, but by the quiet, undeniable presence of something neither of them could ignore any longer. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt precise, like every word that had been spoken had settled into place and now demanded to be understood, and Ethan found himself leaning forward slightly, not out of pressure, but because distance no longer made sense when the truth had already closed the gap between them, and Amara remained. Exactly as she had been since he walked in, steady, composed, her presence not defensive but defined, as if everything she was had been built with intention and did not require explanation to exist. How long? Ethan asked after a moment, his voice quieter now, not lacking authority but carrying less of it, shaped instead by something closer to restraint, and Amara's eyes did not shift away from him when she answered. 6 years, she said, and the number did not echo loudly, but it expanded in his mind, stretching across seasons, milestones, moments he had never seen, first steps, first words, quiet nights, small victories, all of it unfolding without him, not hidden from him by chance, but by the natural consequence of a choice he had made without fully understanding its reach. Ethan nodded once, slowly, absorbing it, not reacting outwardly, but internally adjusting, recalculating, not in the strategic way he approached business, but in a way that felt unfamiliar, more personal, more grounded, and for the first time, he allowed himself to consider not just what he had lost, but what she had carried alone. You built all of this, he said, his gaze briefly moving across the office, the clean lines, the quiet strength of the space, the kind of success that did not announce itself but was evident in every detail, and Amara followed his glance for a second before returning her attention to him. Yes, she answered simply, and there was no pride in the tone, no need to highlight the difficulty behind it, because the result spoke clearly enough. While raising him, Ethan added, and this time there was something more in his voice, not disbelief, but recognition, the kind that comes when someone finally understands the scale of something they once underestimated, and Amara's expression did not change, but her eyes held his for a fraction longer. That was never separate, she said, and the statement settled into the space between them with quiet certainty, because for her, there had never been a division between who she was professionally and who she was as a mother. Both had been built at the same time, shaped by the same determination, the same refusal to break, under circumstances that had not been designed in her favor. Ethan exhaled slowly, his hand resting lightly against his knee, grounding himself again, because the more he understood, the more the past shifted from something distant into something present, something that now had weighed in this room, and he realized that this conversation was not about reclaiming anything, not about stepping back into a role he had never played. It was about facing what already existed without him. "Does he know?" he asked then, and Amara did not need to clarify what he meant. The question was direct enough, and she shook her head once. "No," she said, and there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just a clear boundary, and Ethan nodded again, slower this time, because that answer carried its own set of implications, not as a barrier, but as a responsibility that had not yet been defined. "And you were not going to tell him?" he continued, not pressing, but needing to understand the full shape of what stood in front of him, and Amara's gaze softened slightly, not toward him, but toward the thought itself. "I was going to tell him the truth when he was ready to understand it," she said, her voice steady. "Not before, not because of pressure, not because of timing that does not belong to him." And Ethan listened, really listened, because this was not about exclusion, not about keeping him away. It was about protecting something that had been built carefully, intentionally, over years that he had not been part of. He leaned back slightly, processing, the edges of his certainty shifting again, because this was not a situation he could approach with authority or expectation. It required something else, something he had not practiced: patience, restraint, presence without control, and that realization sat heavier than any negotiation he had ever entered. "I would like to know him," he said after a moment, and the words were measured, not a demand, not even a request shaped with expectation, but an acknowledgement of what he felt. And Amara did not respond immediately, not because she was considering whether to allow it, but because she was measuring how it would fit into a life that was already complete without him. "This is not about what you would like," she said calmly, not unkindly, just clearly, and Ethan did not react defensively, did not push back, because he understood the truth in that statement, even if it was difficult to accept. "Then what is it about?" he asked, and this time there was no tension in the question, only a willingness to hear what he had not considered before. Amara held his gaze, her posture unchanged, her presence steady. "It is about what is right for him," she said, and there was no room for negotiation in that, no space for interpretation, because the center of this was no longer their past. It was a child who had grown without confusion, without disruption, and who deserved to have his world expanded carefully, not abruptly. Ethan nodded slowly, the movement small but deliberate, because for the first time, the focus shifted completely away from him, away from what he had lost or wanted, and towards something that required him to step back, to approach differently, to earn rather than assume. The room remained quiet, but the silence had changed again, no longer just a space for truth, but a space for understanding. And as Ethan looked at Amara, really looked at her now, not as someone from his past, but as someone who had built something strong, something stable, something that did not need him to function, he felt a different kind of realization settle in, one that did not come with immediate answers, but with a clear direction, that whatever came next would not be defined by what he once was, but by what he chose to become from this moment forward. And for the first time in a long time, that choice did not feel like control, it felt like responsibility. The air in the office shifted again, not dramatically, but enough that Ethan could feel the change settle into his chest, heavier than before, because now the conversation was no longer circling the truth, it had landed directly on it, and what remained was not discovery, but direction, and for a man who had built his entire life on knowing what came next, that unfamiliar space felt both unsettling and necessary at the same time. He did not move immediately, did not reach for another question out of habit. Instead, he let the silence stretch just long enough to understand that this moment was not about filling it, it was about respecting it, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried less force, but more intention. "What do you need from me?" The question did not come easily, not because it was complicated, but because it required a shift he had never had to make before, from leading to listening, from deciding to asking, and Amara noticed that, not the words themselves, but the weight behind them, the difference in how they arrived, and she held his gaze for a moment, measuring not his tone, but his willingness to remain in it. "Consistency," she said, her answer immediate, not rehearsed, not uncertain, just clear, and Ethan nodded slightly, though the words settled into him with more depth than its simplicity suggested. "Not presence for a moment," she continued calmly. "Not attention because this is new, Not effort because it feels urgent right now. Consistency over time, without disruption, without control. And as she spoke, there was no sharpness in her tone, no edge of accusation, just clarity, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what matters and what does not. Ethan listened without interruption, because for the first time, he understood that speaking too quickly would only return him to the version of himself that had created this distance in the first place, and that version no longer fit here. "And if I cannot give that immediately?" he asked, not as an excuse, but as a recognition of the reality she was describing, and Amara did not hesitate. "Then you do not begin," she said, her voice steady. "Because inconsistency is worse than absence." And the statement landed with quiet precision, not dramatic, not forceful, but undeniable. And Ethan felt it settle into him in a way that reshaped the entire situation, because this was not about proving himself quickly, not about stepping in and filling a role. It was about building something slowly, carefully, if at all. He leaned back slightly, his gaze lowering for just a moment as he processed that, not in resistance, but in understanding, because the rules here were different, and they were not his to set. "I understand," he said finally, and the words were not used lightly, not as a reflex, but as a decision, and Amara watched him for a second longer, as if confirming that he did. The city beyond the glass moved steadily, cars threading through streets, people crossing intersections, life continuing in its usual rhythm, and inside the office, the conversation settled into something quieter, something more grounded, because the initial shock had passed, the truth had been acknowledged, and what remained was the space where choices would begin to take shape. "There is something else," Amara said then, and Ethan lifted his gaze back to hers, attentive now in a way that did not rely on control, but on presence. "You do not get to rewrite what happened," she continued, her tone unchanged, not harsh, but firm. "You do not get to soften it, or adjust it, or make it something it was not. Not for me, not for him, not for yourself." And Ethan did not interrupt, did not argue, because he knew exactly what she meant, the instinct to reshape the past into something easier to carry, something that allowed him to move forward without fully facing it. And that instinct had no place here. "I will not," he said, and this time there was no hesitation, no partial answer, just a clear commitment, because for the first time, he understood that truth was not something to navigate around. It was something to stand in, fully, without adjustment. Amara nodded once, a small acknowledgement, not approval, but acceptance of what had been said, and for a moment, the tension that had lingered beneath the surface eased slightly, not disappearing, but settling into something more stable. "Noah's world is steady," she said after a brief pause, her voice softening just slightly when she spoke his name. "He knows who he is, he knows where he belongs, and nothing about this changes that." And Ethan felt the weight of that statement immediately, because it placed everything that might come next within a clear boundary, one that did not bend for his presence, one that required him to approach carefully, deliberately, if he chose to step into it at all. "I would not want to disrupt that," he said, and the sincerity in his voice was not forced, not calculated. It came from a place that had shifted significantly since the night before, and Amara saw that, not as proof, but as a beginning, something that would need time to confirm itself. She stood then, not abruptly, but with quiet finality, signaling that the conversation, at least for now, had reached its natural end, and Ethan followed her movement with his eyes before rising as well, the physical act of standing feeling different now, not like leaving a meeting, but like stepping out of something that had changed him in ways he had not fully processed yet. "I will think about what you said," he told her, and she nodded slightly. "That is what you should do," she replied, and there was no urgency in her tone, no expectation of immediate action, because this was not a decision to be made quickly, it was one to be made correctly. As he turned toward the door, the card still in his hand though he no longer needed it, Ethan paused for just a second, not to speak, but to look back, to take in the space, the woman, the life that had been built without him, and for the first time, he did not feel the instinct to reclaim it, to step into it as if it had been waiting for him. Instead, he felt something else entirely, a quiet understanding that if he was to be part of it at all, it would be by invitation, by effort, by change, and not by assumption. When he stepped out into the hallway, the quiet returned, But it felt different now. Not empty, not distant, but reflective. And as the elevator doors closed behind him, Ethan Caldwell, the man who had always known his next move, stood in stillness for just a moment longer, because for the first time, what came next was not something he could control, it was something he would have to earn. The elevator ride down felt longer than it should have, not because of distance, but because Ethan stood still inside it, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes unfocused for a moment as the reflection of himself in the mirrored walls stared back with a quiet unfamiliarity. And for the first time in years, he did not recognize the certainty in that reflection, not because it was gone, but because it had shifted into something less rigid, something that no longer answered every question before it was asked. When the doors opened, the lobby greeted him with the same polished calm it had before, people moving with intention, voices low, footsteps measured. But now he noticed the details differently, the pauses between conversations, the subtle exchanges of trust, the quiet consistency that built everything beneath the surface. And it echoed something Amara had said, something simple that now felt like the foundation of everything he had not understood before. Consistency. He stepped outside, the city air cooler than it had been the night before, brushing against his face as traffic moved steadily along the avenue, horns distant, the rhythm of life continuing without pause. And for a moment, he did not move toward his car, did not reach for his phone, did not shift back into the pace he had always maintained. Instead, he stood there, letting the moment settle fully, because leaving her office had not ended anything. It had only begun something he could not approach the way he approached everything else. The driver opened the door for him without a word, and Ethan nodded once before stepping inside, the familiar interior of the car wrapping around him, quiet, controlled, predictable. But even that comfort felt different now, like something that belonged to a version of him that had been complete without question, without interruption. And now there was a space in that completeness, a space shaped like 6 years he had not lived. As the car moved through the city, Ethan reached into his pocket, not for his phone, but for the card again, though he no longer needed the address. And he studied it for a second longer than necessary, not because of what it said, but because of what it represented, a life built without him, a life that had not paused or struggled in his absence, but had grown, steadily, deliberately, into something he now had to approach with care. His phone buzzed then, a call, his assistant's name flashing across the screen, routine, expected, and for a second, his thumb hovered over it before he answered, his voice returning to its usual tone, controlled, efficient. Yes. And the conversation that followed was exactly what it always was. Numbers, timelines, decisions that required clarity and speed, and he moved through it easily, answering, directing, resolving, because that part of him had not changed. That part still functioned exactly as it always had, but beneath it, something else remained, something quieter, something that did not disappear. Just because he returned to familiar ground. When the call ended, he did not immediately pick up the next one, did not scroll through messages or adjust his schedule. Instead, he leaned back slightly, looking out the window as the city passed by, and his thoughts returned not to business, not to strategy, but to a small boy with steady eyes and a calm presence, to a woman who had built an entire life without asking for anything in return, and to a truth that now required him to decide who he would be moving forward, not in the boardroom, not in headlines, but in a space where control meant nothing if it was not matched by consistency. By the time he reached his office, the familiar structure of his day had resumed around him, meetings lined up, expectations set, people waiting for direction, and he stepped into it without hesitation, because that world still required him, still depended on the version of himself that made decisions without pause. And yet, as he moved through the hours, something remained different, not in what he did, but in how he noticed things. The way time stretched between meetings, the way conversations carried more weight than before, the way he found himself less interested in finishing quickly and more aware of what was actually being said. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable to anyone else, but to him, it was a shift he could not ignore. Later that afternoon, when the final meeting ended and the room emptied, Ethan remained seated for a moment longer, the silence settling around him in a way that felt familiar now, not empty, not uncomfortable, but necessary, and he let his hands rest on the table as he replayed the conversation from earlier, not the words themselves, but the meaning behind them, the boundaries, the clarity, the absence of anything that resembled expectation or need. She had not asked him for anything beyond consistency. She had not demanded explanation, had not questioned his past decisions, had not tried to pull him into something he had not earned, and that realization carried its own weight, because it meant that whatever came next would not be given. It would be built, slowly, intentionally, over time. He stood then, the movement deliberate, and walked toward the window, the skyline stretching out in front of him, buildings rising in clean lines, each one representing years of effort, planning, execution, and he understood that the same principle applied here, but in a way that did not allow shortcuts, did not allow immediate results. And for a man who had spent his life accelerating outcomes, that requirement felt both foreign and necessary. That evening, when he returned home, the quiet of the penthouse felt different, not empty, but incomplete in a way he had never noticed before, and he moved through it slowly, setting his jacket aside, loosening his tie, the routine actions grounding him as his thoughts continued to shift, not toward regret, but toward recognition, because regret alone would not change anything. It would not build what had never existed. It would not create a connection that had not been there. And for the first time, Ethan understood that what lay ahead was not about correcting the past. It was about choosing differently now, consistently, without expectation of immediate return. He paused near the window, the city lights stretching out beneath him, and for a moment he allowed himself to imagine something he had never considered before, not a version of success defined by numbers or influence, but one shaped by presence, by showing up, not once, not for a moment, but over time, steadily, without interruption, and that image did not come with certainty, did not come with a clear path, but it felt real in a way that nothing else had that day. The phone buzzed again. Another call, another decision waiting to be made, and Ethan reached for it, answering with the same control he always had. But now there was something else beneath it, something quieter, something that did not need to be spoken, because for the first time in a long time, the most important decision he would make was not about business, not about strategy, but about whether he was willing to become the kind of man who could stand in that office again, not as someone trying to reclaim what he had lost, but as someone who had earned the right to be there at all. The next morning did not arrive with clarity. It arrived with routine, and for Ethan Caldwell, routine had always been the structure that kept everything in place, the thing that allowed him to move without hesitation, to act without second-guessing. But now, as the early light stretched across the floor of his penthouse and settled against the glass, there was a quiet awareness beneath it all, something that did not disrupt his movements but followed them closely, like a shadow that had finally caught up. He moved through the morning the same way he always did, measured, efficient, each action precise, coffee poured, schedule reviewed, calls anticipated, but the difference was not in what he did, it was in what stayed with him. The image of a small boy with steady eyes, the sound of Amara's voice when she said one word that had shifted everything. Yes, and the weight of what that answer meant had not lessened overnight. It had settled deeper, becoming something he could not ignore even as the day demanded his attention. By the time he arrived at his office, the building was already alive with movement. Assistants crossing the lobby, executives stepping into elevators, conversations beginning before doors fully closed, and he stepped into it seamlessly, because that world still recognized him, still moved in response to his presence, still aligned itself with the decisions he made. And for a moment, it would have been easy to let that familiarity take over, to let the rhythm of control return completely, but something held him just slightly outside of it, just enough that he noticed the difference. His assistant met him as he stepped out of the elevator, tablet in hand, voice steady as she outlined the morning's priorities, numbers, negotiations, projections that required immediate attention, and Ethan listened, responding where necessary, adjusting where needed, but his responses carried a different cadence now, not slower, not uncertain, just more deliberate, as if each decision passed through an extra layer before being released. Move the call with the West Coast team to the afternoon, he said at one point, and his assistant paused for a fraction of a second, not because the request was unusual, but because it was, in a way, It was not like him to shift something without immediate reason, but she nodded and adjusted the schedule without question, and Ethan continued forward, his focus returning to the tasks in front of him, but not fully, not completely. Hours passed the way they always did, meetings flowing into each other, conversations sharp, efficient, outcomes reached without delay, and to anyone watching, nothing had changed. He was still the same man, still the same presence, still the same authority that defined every room he entered. But internally, something had shifted, something quieter, something that did not interrupt his work but existed alongside it, shaping the way he thought about time, about presence, about what it meant to show up not just once, but continuously. In the middle of a meeting, as a senior partner outlined a new expansion strategy, Ethan found his attention drifting for just a second, not away from the conversation, but toward a different question entirely, one that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the conversation from the day before. What does consistency look like when it has never been practiced before? And the answer did not come immediately, not in a way that could be written down or structured into a plan. Because this was not a strategy, it was a shift in behavior, in mindset, in something deeper than execution. He brought his focus back quickly, responding to the proposal with the same clarity he always had. But the question remained, not demanding, not urgent, just present, waiting for him to understand it over time rather than solve it immediately. Later that afternoon, when the meetings finally slowed and the office quieted just enough for him to hear his own thoughts again, Ethan made a decision that did not feel like one of his usual moves. It was not calculated, not driven by outcome. It was simple, deliberate, and for him, unfamiliar. He reached for his phone, not to call, not to schedule, but to send a message, and for a moment, he paused, not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood that what he said mattered in a different way now, not for negotiation, not for influence, but for clarity, for honesty, for the first step in something that could not be rushed. He typed slowly, not out of uncertainty, but out of intention, each word chosen carefully, not to impress, not to persuade, but to reflect exactly where he stood. And when he finished, he read it once, not for correction, but for truth, before sending it without hesitation. The message was simple, direct. I understand what you said. I will not rush this. I will show up the right way, or not at all. He set the phone down after that, not expecting an immediate response, not waiting for one, because that was not the point. The point was not to receive something back. It was to begin something forward, and for the first time, he allowed that to be enough. The rest of the day continued, but the weight of that small action stayed with him, not as pressure, but as a quiet marker, the first step taken without expectation of return, without control over the outcome. And as the evening approached and the office began to empty, Ethan remained for a while longer, standing near the window, looking out over the city as the light shifted from day to night, the skyline changing color, the streets below filling with movement that felt both distant and connected at the same time. He thought about Noah then, not in abstract, not as a concept, but as a child, 6 years old, with a life already shaped, with routines, with preferences, with a sense of the world that did not include him. And for the first time, Ethan did not feel the urge to step into that space immediately, to claim it, to define it. Instead, he felt something else, a recognition that if he was to be part of it, it would not begin with presence alone. It would begin with patience, with understanding, with the willingness to be introduced into that world slowly, on terms that were not his to set. When he finally left the office that night, the city felt different again, not quieter, not slower, but more real in a way he had not noticed before. And as he stepped into the car and the door closed behind him, Ethan did not reach for his phone immediately, did not shift back into the rhythm of constant movement. Instead, he sat there for a moment, allowing the day to settle, allowing the shift within him to take shape without forcing it into something it was not yet ready to become, because, for the first time in a long time, he understood that not everything needed to be decided immediately. Some things needed to be built, slowly, deliberately, one consistent step at a time. The message did not receive a response that night, and Ethan had not expected one. But when morning came and the soft light filtered through the glass walls of his bedroom, there was a quiet awareness in him that something had shifted regardless of whether it had been acknowledged yet. And for the first time in a long time, He did not reach for his phone immediately upon waking, did not scan for updates or missed calls. Instead, he lay there for a moment longer, staring at the ceiling as the city slowly came to life beyond the windows, and he allowed the stillness to remain, not filling it with urgency, not breaking it with movement, because something in him understood that this space, this pause, was part of what he needed to learn. When he eventually rose and moved through his morning routine, the rhythm was the same, precise, controlled, but his attention was not divided the way it had always been. It was more focused, more intentional, and when he finally checked his phone, there was a message waiting, not long, not elaborate, just a single line from Amara that carried more meaning than anything else she could have written. "We will see." Ethan read it once, then again, not searching for hidden meaning, not trying to interpret tone, because there was none to interpret. It was exactly what it was, neither acceptance nor rejection, simply space, the same space she had maintained from the beginning. And for the first time, he did not feel the need to close that space immediately, to define it or move through it faster. He simply accepted it for what it was, a beginning that would not announce itself as one. The day unfolded as it always did. Meetings, decisions, conversations that required precision and clarity, and Ethan moved through them without hesitation. But the difference remained, not in his actions, but in the awareness behind them. The way he noticed the passage of time differently, the way he measured the weight of moments that would have once passed without consideration. And it became clear to him that consistency was not something that existed only in large gestures. It lived in the small ones, the repeated ones, the ones that did not demand attention but built something over time. By late afternoon, when his schedule finally opened just enough to allow a break, Ethan made another decision, one that did not align with his usual patterns, one that was not driven by urgency or expectation, but by something quieter, something that felt closer to intention. He left the office without an announcement, without an adjustment to his calendar that required explanation, and the driver followed his instructions without question as the car moved away from the familiar route toward a different part of the city, one that did not hold his usual destinations, one that felt less structured, less defined by the world he operated in. He had not planned the exact location, had not mapped it out the way he would any other move, but he found himself guiding the car toward a park he had passed countless times without noticing, a wide stretch of open space framed by trees that had begun to turn with the season, the grass worn in places where people gathered, the air carrying a mix of quiet conversation and distant laughter. And when the car stopped, Ethan stepped out slowly, taking in the scene in a way that felt unfamiliar, not as an observer of the city from above, but as someone standing within it. Children moved across the open field, some running, some walking beside parents, some sitting on the ground with small hands busy with things that held their attention completely, and Ethan stood there for a moment, not moving forward immediately, just watching, not searching for anything specific, but allowing himself to understand something he had never needed to before, what it meant to be present in a space that was not defined by outcome, by success, by measurable results, but by time spent, by consistency that built trust without announcement. He walked slowly along the path, his steps unhurried, his posture still carrying the presence of who he was, but his focus shifting to something else entirely. And as he passed a small playground, he noticed a father kneeling beside a child, adjusting something, speaking softly, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that built connection, and it was simple, almost unremarkable, but it held a kind of weight Ethan had never considered before, because it was not about a single moment. It was about being there, again and again, in ways that did not announce themselves but mattered deeply. He did not stay long, not because he needed to leave, but because the point had already settled into him. And when he returned to the car, the city felt slightly different again, not changed, but clearer in a way that allowed him to see beyond the surface he had always navigated. That evening, when he returned home, the quiet of the penthouse no longer felt incomplete in the same way it had the night before. It felt like space to think, to understand, to adjust without pressure, and he moved through it with a slower rhythm, setting his things down, pouring a glass of water, standing by the window as the city lights came alive beneath him, and his thoughts returned not to what he needed to do next, but to what he needed to become over time. He did not reach out again that night, did not send another message, did not try to accelerate anything that had already been set in motion, because for the first time, he understood that consistency was not proven in a day. It was shown over days, weeks, months, in ways that did not demand recognition but built something real. As he stood there, looking out over the city, Ethan Caldwell, a man who had built everything through control and precision, felt something else begin to take shape within him, something quieter, something steadier, not a plan, not a strategy, but a shift, one that would not be measured by how quickly it moved, but by how consistently it stayed, and for the first time, that felt like enough. Days did not transform him overnight, and Ethan Caldwell did not expect them to. But what changed was not the speed of his life. It was the way he carried it, the way he noticed where his time went, the way he recognized moments that once passed without meaning. And by the third day after that conversation, something subtle had already begun to take shape, not visible to anyone else, but present enough that he could not ignore it. He did not reach out again, not because he had forgotten, but because he had understood what space meant now, not absence, but patience, and instead, he adjusted something far more difficult, his own rhythm. He left his office earlier than usual that afternoon, not dramatically, not with announcement, just a quiet shift in his schedule that required no explanation to anyone but himself. And when his assistant glanced at him with a slight pause, he simply said, "Move anything that can wait." And she nodded, making the adjustment without question, because even though it was unusual, it was still him making a decision, and that had always been enough. The city felt different again as he stepped out, not quieter, not slower, but more detailed, like he was seeing layers he had never needed to before. And this time, he did not return to the same park he had visited before. Instead, he moved through a different part of the city, one that felt less curated, less polished, where the sidewalks were narrower, the buildings closer, the rhythm of life more immediate. And he walked without urgency, his hands relaxed at his sides, his pace unhurried. Because this was not about destination, it was about understanding something he had never been required to understand. He passed a small bookstore, the kind that did not rely on foot traffic from executives or business deals, but from people who came back again and again, and something about that stayed with him as he continued walking. The idea of return, not once, not for a moment, but consistently, over time. When he finally stopped, it was in front of a school, not large, not imposing, just a simple building with a small playground to the side, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the ground, and parents were beginning to gather near the gate, some standing alone, some speaking quietly with each other, and children's voices could be heard in the distance, rising and falling in that unstructured way that carried energy without direction. Ethan did not step closer immediately. He remained across the street, watching, not searching for anyone specific, not expecting to see something that would resolve anything for him, but simply observing, because this was a world he had never entered, never needed to, and yet now it felt connected to him in a way that could not be ignored. The bell rang a few minutes later, sharp but brief, and the doors opened, and children began to spill out, backpacks bouncing against their shoulders, voices louder now, movement less contained, and the parents stepped forward, greeting them, kneeling down, taking hands, adjusting jackets, asking questions that did not require perfect answers, and Ethan watched it all, not as an outsider judging it, but as someone trying to understand what it meant to be part of something like that, something built not on moments, but on repetition, on showing up again and again without needing recognition for it. He did not stay long, because this was not about inserting himself into a place he did not belong yet. It was about recognizing what would be required if he ever did. And when he turned away, walking back toward the car that waited at the corner, the image stayed with him, not as something distant, but as something real, something that existed every day whether he was part of it or not. That night, when he returned home, he did not immediately step into work again, did not open his laptop or review numbers the way he normally would. Instead, he moved through the space more slowly, setting his phone aside, letting the quiet remain without interruption, and for a while, he simply sat, his hands resting loosely, his mind not racing toward solutions, but settling into understanding. When the message came, it was not immediate, not reactive. It arrived later, simple, direct, just like before, and he picked up his phone without urgency, opening it to see her name, and for a brief moment, the room felt smaller, not in pressure, but in focus, as if everything else had stepped back to allow this moment to stand on its own. Saturday morning, the message read, 10 o'clock, there is a park near Noah's school. You can come, but you will not approach, you will not interrupt, you will observe, and you will leave. Ethan read it once, then again, not because he needed to confirm the words, but because he understood what they meant. This was not an invitation, not in the way he had always understood invitations. This was an opportunity, controlled, limited, structured around boundaries that were not his to adjust. And for a moment, he felt the instinct to respond immediately, to acknowledge, to confirm, but he paused, remembering what he had already begun to learn, that this was not about speed, not about immediate response. It was about consistency, about showing up when it mattered, not just when it was convenient. He set the phone down after a moment, not ignoring it, but allowing the weight of it to settle first, because Saturday was not today, it was not tomorrow, it was something that required patience, something that would test not just whether he would show up, but how he would show up, and for the first time, that distinction mattered more than anything else. When he finally responded, his message was simple, direct, mirroring hers in its clarity. I understand. There was no added explanation, no attempt to shape the moment beyond what it already was, because he knew now that anything more would only disrupt what had been carefully set in place. As the night deepened and the city lights stretched out beneath him, Ethan stood by the window again. But this time, the view did not feel like something he controlled. It felt like something he was part of, something that continued regardless of him. And that realization no longer unsettled him. It grounded him, because for the first time, he understood that what he was stepping into could not be owned. It could only be earned, one consistent moment at a time. Saturday morning did not arrive with urgency. It arrived with quiet clarity, the kind that settles into a space before anything else has a chance to fill it. And Ethan Caldwell was already awake before the light fully broke across the city, not because he had set an alarm, but because something in him understood that this moment required more than punctuality. It required presence, and he moved through the morning without rushing, without the sharp precision that usually defined his routine. Instead, allowing each action to unfold at a steady pace, deliberate, grounded, as if preparing not for a meeting, not for a negotiation, but for something that could not be controlled once it began. By the time he stepped outside, the air carried a soft chill, the kind that hinted at a season shifting, and the city had not yet reached its usual volume. The streets quieter, the movement slower, and as the car carried him toward the park Amara had mentioned, Ethan did not check his phone, did not review anything, did not fill the space with distraction. He simply watched, the buildings passing by, the light changing, the world moving forward without needing him to direct it. And for once, that felt right. He arrived early, earlier than necessary, and when the car stopped, he stepped out without hesitation, his eyes taking in the open space ahead, the trees casting long shadows across the grass, the playground still only partially filled, the morning not yet fully formed, and he paused for a moment, not to gather himself, but to recognize that this was not his space to enter, not his moment to shape. This was something he had been allowed to witness, nothing more. He chose a bench at the edge of the park, far enough to maintain distance, close enough to see clearly, and he sat without adjusting his posture, without drawing attention to himself, his presence quiet, contained, exactly as it needed to be. And as the minutes passed, the park slowly came to life around him, parents arriving with children, small groups forming, conversations beginning, laughter rising in soft bursts, and Ethan remained still, not observing as an outsider, but as someone learning how to exist in a moment without changing it. When he saw them, he did not move, not even slightly, but something inside him shifted, not sharply, not dramatically, just a quiet recognition settling into place, because Amara walked into the park with the same steady presence she carried everywhere, her posture relaxed, her expression calm, and beside her, Noah moved with a lightness that carried energy without chaos, his small steps quick, his attention already drawn toward the open space ahead, and Ethan felt his focus narrow, not to isolate them from everything else, but because everything else naturally faded when they entered the frame of his attention. Amara did not look toward him, not once, not even in passing, and that was intentional. It maintained the boundary she had set. It kept the moment exactly as it was meant to be, and Ethan respected that, not by effort, but by understanding, because this was not about acknowledgement, it was about consistency, about showing up and staying within the space that had been defined. Noah moved ahead slightly, his attention drawn to something in the grass, and Amara followed at a measured pace, not calling him back, not correcting him, just allowing him the freedom to move within a space she had already made safe. And Ethan watched that interaction carefully, not analyzing it, not breaking it down, but absorbing it, the ease, the trust, the way presence did not need to be announced when it was already established. The morning stretched slowly, minutes folding into each other without urgency, and Ethan remained on the bench, his posture unchanged, his gaze steady, not fixed in a way that would draw attention, but present in a way that did not miss anything. And as he watched Noah move through the park, climbing, running, stopping to examine small things that caught his interest, he began to understand something deeper than he had before. That this was not about a single introduction, not about a moment where everything would shift at once. This was about time, about repetition, about showing up in ways that did not disrupt what already existed. At one point, Noah laughed, a clear, unfiltered sound that carried across the space without effort, and Ethan felt it before he fully processed it, something subtle but undeniable, a connection that did not come from proximity, but from recognition, and he did not move toward it, did not react outwardly, but internally, something aligned, something that had been abstract before becoming real in a way that could not be dismissed. Amara remained near, not hovering, not controlling, but present, her attention moving with Noah without restricting him, and Ethan saw in that a kind of balance he had never practiced, the ability to be there without directing everything, to allow space while maintaining connection, and it settled into him as something he would have to learn, not immediately, not perfectly, but over time. The hour passed without announcement, no signal marking its end, but Ethan knew when it was time, not because of a clock, but because the moment had reached its natural conclusion, and when Amara gently called Noah over, her voice calm, steady, he responded without hesitation, moving back toward her with the same ease he had carried all morning, and together they began to leave, not hurried, not lingering, just moving forward as they always had, and Ethan did not stand, did not follow, did not break the boundary that had been set. He remained where he was, watching them go, not because he expected anything to change, but because he understood that this was exactly what had been asked of him. As they disappeared from view, the park returned to its usual rhythm, other families, other moments unfolding, but for Ethan, something had shifted again, not in a way that demanded action, but in a way that clarified direction, and when he finally stood, his movements slow, deliberate, he did not feel the need to rush back to his car, did not feel the need to fill the silence that followed. He simply walked. The path ahead clear not because it had been planned, but because it had been understood, and for the first time, that was enough. The park did not hold on to his presence after he left, and Ethan Caldwell understood that as he walked along the edge of the path, the morning light now fully settled across the open space, the sound of children still carrying behind him, unchanged by the fact that he had been there at all, and for the first time, that absence of impact did not feel like failure. It felt like clarity, because this was never about altering anything in a single moment. It was about learning how to exist without needing to be seen immediately. He did not look back, not because he did not want to, but because he understood that the moment had already given him everything it was meant to give, and anything beyond that would have been his own attempt to take more than what had been offered, and that was no longer who he was trying to be. The car waited where it had been left, the driver stepping forward as Ethan approached, opening the door without a word, and Ethan paused for just a second before getting in, his gaze lifting briefly toward the trees, toward the space where Noah had been running minutes before, and then he stepped inside, the door closing softly behind him as the city began to pull him back into its rhythm. The drive back was quiet, not because there was nothing to think about, but because everything he needed to process had already settled into place, not as a list, not as a plan, but as a direction, something steady that did not require immediate action, only continuation, and when his phone buzzed, he did not reach for it right away, allowing the moment to remain uninterrupted for just a little longer. When he finally picked it up, the message waiting was simple, just like before, "You stayed." And for a brief second, Ethan's thumb hovered over the screen, not because he did not know how to respond, but because the weight of those two words carried more than anything longer could have. They were not praise, not approval, just acknowledgement, and that was enough. He typed slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of care, "I said I would." And when he sent it, he did not wait for a reply, did not look for confirmation, because this was not about immediate exchange, it was about building something that did not rely on instant validation. By the time he reached his office, the day had already begun to fill with the usual demands, meetings stacked, decisions waiting, conversations requiring clarity and direction, and Ethan stepped back into that world with the same precision he always had. But there was something different beneath it now, something that did not disrupt his work, but changed how he carried it. The awareness that what mattered most was not happening in these rooms, not being decided in these conversations, but was being built somewhere else, slowly, without urgency, and that shift allowed him to move through his responsibilities without losing sight of what he was learning. During a meeting that afternoon, as executives debated timelines and projections, Ethan found himself listening differently, not just to the outcome being discussed, but to the process, to the way consistency shaped results over time, and it struck him how similar the principle was, how everything that lasted was built not on singular moments, but on repeated effort, on showing up again and again even when there was no immediate reward. And for the first time, that understanding extended beyond business into something far more personal. When the meeting ended, he remained seated for a moment longer, the room slowly emptying around him, and he let the silence settle again, not filling it with the next task, not rushing to the next decision, because this pause had become something he valued, something that allowed him to process without pressure. And as he sat there, his thoughts returned to Noah, not as a distant figure, but as a presence he had now seen, heard, observed in a way that made everything real, and the realization did not come with urgency. It came with steadiness, the understanding that whatever came next would not happen all at once. It would unfold gradually, if he allowed it to. That evening, when he returned home, the quiet felt familiar in a new way, not empty, not incomplete, but open, and he moved through it with the same calm he had begun to carry throughout the day, setting his phone aside, loosening the structure that had once defined every hour. And as he stood by the window, the city lights stretching out beneath him, he did not feel the need to fill the space with anything else. He simply stood there, present, aware, allowing the day to settle fully before moving forward. When his phone buzzed again later, he picked it up without hesitation, the message short, direct, "Next Saturday, same time." And Ethan read it once, the meaning clear, the pattern beginning to form, and he nodded slightly to himself, not because he needed to confirm anything, but because he understood what it represented, not a breakthrough, not a sudden shift, but a continuation, a step that followed the one before it, steady, consistent, exactly as it needed to be. He did not respond immediately, not because he was unsure, but because he understood that his response would not define the moment, his presence would. And when he finally typed, his message was simple, just like before, "I will be there." And when he sent it, he set the phone down without waiting, because for the first time, the most important part was not what he said, it was what he would do next. As the night deepened and the city moved around him, Ethan Caldwell stood in the quiet of his own space, no longer trying to control what lay ahead, no longer trying to accelerate something that required time. And for the first time, that did not feel like uncertainty. It felt like direction, clear, steady, and entirely different from anything he had known before. The second Saturday arrived with less uncertainty and more awareness, not because the situation had changed, but because Ethan Caldwell had. And as the early light settled over the city once again, he moved through his morning with the same deliberate calm he had carried the week before, not rushing, not overthinking, just preparing himself to show up in the way that had been asked of him, nothing more, nothing less. When he stepped into the car, there was no need to check directions, no need to confirm the location, because the path had already been set, not just physically, but mentally, and as the city passed by outside the window, Ethan did not fill the silence with calls or messages. He allowed it to remain, because that quiet had become part of the process, something that grounded him before stepping into a space that required more than presence. It required restraint. The park looked almost identical to the week before, the same stretch of grass, the same trees catching the morning light, the same slow arrival of families moving into the space with ease, and Ethan stepped out of the car with the same measured pace, his posture relaxed but attentive, his focus already narrowing in a way that did not isolate, but clarified, and he returned to the same bench, not out of habit, but because it represented the boundary he had been given, a place where he could exist without altering anything beyond himself. This time, he did not need to wait long before he saw them. Amara walking in with the same quiet confidence, Noah beside her with that familiar energy, his steps quick, his attention already pulled toward the open space ahead, and Ethan felt the same shift within him, but it was different now, less sharp, more settled, like something that had begun to find its place rather than disrupt everything around it. He did not move, did not adjust his position, because that was not what this moment required. And as he watched Noah run toward a small group of children, joining them without hesitation, Ethan noticed something he had not fully seen before. The ease with which connection formed at that age. The way children did not overthink, did not hesitate. They simply stepped into the moment and became part of it. And it struck him how different that was from the world he operated in, where every interaction was measured, every decision calculated, every move deliberate. Amara remained at a distance, watching Noah with a calm attentiveness that did not interfere with his freedom, and Ethan recognized that balance more clearly now, the ability to be present without controlling, to allow space while still maintaining connection, and it settled into him as something he would have to learn not through observation alone, but through practice, through time, through consistency that could not be rushed. The hour unfolded quietly, the rhythm of the park steady, children moving, parents watching, conversations blending into the background, and Ethan remained where he was, not passive, not detached, but engaged in a way that did not demand attention. And as he watched Noah navigate the space, laughing, pausing, returning to Amara briefly before moving away again, he began to understand something deeper. That presence was not about constant interaction. It was about reliability, about being there, in a way that did not need to be questioned. At one point, Noah fell slightly behind as the group of children moved toward another part of the playground, not falling in a way that caused alarm, just pausing, looking around for a moment as if recalibrating where he wanted to go next, and Ethan felt an instinct rise, subtle but immediate, to move, to step forward, to bridge the distance. But he did not act on it. He remained still, because he understood now that this was not his moment, not his role. And within seconds, Noah turned back toward Amara, finding her without hesitation, and she met him with a calm reassurance that required no urgency. And the moment passed as naturally as it had come, and Ethan felt the lesson settle into him with quiet clarity, that not every instinct needed to be acted on. That presence sometimes meant allowing things to unfold without interference. When the hour came to an end, it did not feel like an ending. It felt like a continuation, a step that followed the one before it. And as Amara called Noah back to her once again, her voice steady, familiar, he responded without delay, moving toward her with the same ease he had shown all morning, and together they began to leave. And this time, something shifted slightly, not in the boundary itself, but in the space around it. Because as they passed the edge of the park, Amara's gaze lifted. Briefly, not directly toward Ethan, not in acknowledgement, but in awareness, a small shift that suggested she knew exactly where he was, that she had always known, and that recognition did not break the boundary. It simply confirmed that it existed with intention. Ethan remained seated until they were gone, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the structure that had been set, and when he finally stood, his movement was slower this time, more grounded, because something had changed, not in the situation, but in his understanding of it. And as he walked back toward the car, the path felt clearer, not because it had been explained to him, but because he had begun to experience it for himself. The drive back was quiet again, but this time, It carried a different kind of weight, not uncertainty, not reflection alone, but a growing sense of direction, something that did not demand immediate action, but required continued presence. And when his phone buzzed, he picked it up without hesitation, the message already familiar in its simplicity. He is starting to notice patterns, and Ethan read it carefully, understanding what it meant without needing further explanation. That consistency was not just being seen, it was being recognized over time, and that recognition would eventually lead to questions, to understanding, to something that could not be rushed or forced. He typed his response slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of care. "Then I will keep showing up." And when he sent it, he did not wait for a reply, because he understood now that the response was not the point, the action was. And as the city moved around him once more, Ethan Caldwell sat in the quiet of the car, no longer trying to control the pace of what lay ahead, no longer trying to define it before it had time to take shape, because for the first time, he understood that what mattered most was not how quickly things changed, but how consistently he remained. By the third Saturday, the air carried a familiarity that did not come from repetition alone, but from something deeper, something that had begun to take root quietly over time. And Ethan Caldwell felt it the moment he stepped out of the car, the same park, the same stretch of open space. But the experience no longer felt like observation alone. It felt like presence that had been acknowledged, even if only in small, unspoken ways. He walked to the same bench without hesitation, his pace steady, his posture relaxed, and as he sat, his gaze naturally found the path where Amara and Noah would appear, not because he was waiting with urgency, but because consistency had created a rhythm, something predictable in the best sense of the word, something that did not require confirmation anymore. When they arrived, it was no different from the weeks before, and yet everything felt slightly altered, not in what happened, but in what it meant, because Noah's movement carried the same energy, the same curiosity, but there was something else now, something subtle, something that lingered in the way he occasionally glanced toward the edges of the park, as if recognizing something without fully understanding it, and Ethan saw it immediately, not as a signal to act, but as a sign that time was doing exactly what it was meant to do. Amara remained steady, her presence unchanged, her attention on Noah without interruption, and when she walked past the line of sight that connected Ethan to the open space, there was no direct acknowledgement, no shift in her expression, but there was no need for it anymore, because the structure had already been established, and both of them understood it without having to redefine it each time. The morning unfolded with the same quiet rhythm, Noah moving between moments of play and brief returns to Amara, laughter rising and fading, the small details of a child's world continuing without disruption, and Ethan remained where he was, not detached, not distant, but present in a way that no longer felt unfamiliar. And as he watched, he realized something that had not fully settled into him before, that this was not about earning a moment. It was about becoming someone who could exist within many moments, consistently, without needing to claim them all at once. At one point, Noah paused again, not lost, not uncertain, but aware, his gaze drifting toward the edge of the park where Ethan sat. And this time, the look lingered a fraction longer, not enough to draw attention, but enough to register, and Ethan felt it, not as a signal to move, but as a quiet connection beginning to form, something fragile, something that required patience more than anything else, and he remained still, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, allowing the moment to exist without interference. When Noah turned back and continued playing, the connection did not disappear, it simply settled, like a thread that had been noticed but not yet followed, and Ethan understood then that this was how it would happen, not through introduction, not through explanation, but through recognition built over time, through patterns that felt safe, that felt consistent, that did not demand answers before they were ready to be understood. The hour passed again without announcement, and when it came time for Amara to call Noah back, her voice carried the same calm certainty, the same familiarity that guided him without effort, and he responded as he always had, moving toward her with ease. And as they turned to leave, something shifted for the first time in a way that could not be ignored, because Noah looked back, not briefly, not in passing, but with intention, his small steps slowing for just a moment as his eyes found Ethan's position across the park, And the look was not confused, not hesitant. It was curious, aware, as if a question had begun to form even if it had not yet been spoken. Ethan did not move, did not react outwardly, but inside, something aligned with quiet certainty, because this was the moment he had been preparing for without forcing it. The moment where presence began to turn into recognition, where consistency began to mean something beyond repetition. And as Noah turned forward again, continuing beside Amara without breaking stride, the moment settled into place exactly as it needed to. Not rushed, not prolonged, just real. Ethan remained on the bench until they were gone, the park returning to its usual rhythm once more, but the silence that followed felt different this time, not reflective, not uncertain, but grounded, as if something had shifted from potential into reality, even if only in the smallest way. When he finally stood, his movement was slow, deliberate, and as he walked back toward the car, the path did not feel like something he was figuring out anymore. It felt like something he was already on, something that did not require constant thought, only continued action. The drive back carried the same quiet as before, but it was no longer filled with questions. It was filled with understanding, and when his phone buzzed, he picked it up without hesitation, the message from Amara waiting in the same simple form. He asked who you are, and Ethan read it carefully, not with surprise, but with recognition, because this was the natural progression of everything that had come before, and he did not rush to respond, not because he did not care, but because he understood that this moment, like all the others, required intention. When he finally typed, his words were steady, measured, reflecting not just what he felt, but what he had learned. Tell him the truth, in the way you believe is right. And when he sent it, he did not wait, did not anticipate a reply, because the response was no longer the focus, the process was. And as he looked out at the city once more, Ethan Caldwell, a man who had once measured everything in outcomes, understood now that the most important things in his life would never be built that way. They would be built slowly, quietly, through presence, through patience, through the kind of consistency that did not demand recognition, but earned it over time. And for the first time, that was not just something he understood, it was something he had become.